Hello. Ooh, good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here, even though it's 9:30 on a Friday morning. My name's Pam Bartlett-Quintanilla. I work with the Greens IFA group in the European Parliament on transparency and democracy issues. And we've organized this session today basically because we want to discuss with you how you think public bodies and politicians, and especially those of us who are working in the European Parliament, how can we help to support independent investigative journalism? For those of you who aren't familiar with the Greens IFA group, we are basically a coalition of 52 elected members of the European Parliament from 19 different countries. And we work inside the EU institutions to defend fair trade, tax justice, a good and healthy food system, environmental protection, of course, fundamental rights, and transparency and democracy, amongst a million other things. So, of course, it goes without saying that media freedom and freedom of expression are fundamental for the proper functioning of any democracy. But as you know, these are rights that can't be taken for granted, and they're rights that we always need to continue to fight for, especially in these sensitive times where the pressure on media outlets and on individual journalists in particular is growing more and more acute and is coming from all angles, I think. So basically, we organized this session because we want to hear from you what you think the best solutions could be to tackle this issue. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. To my right, we have Alexandra Borchardt. She's the Director of Strategic Development at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford. Prior to this, she was Managing Editor of Süddeutsche Zeitung. I hope I pronounced that okay. And she was also founding editor of Süddeutsches Plan W, which is an award-winning quarterly magazine for women and business. In her reporting, she's focused on internet and democracy and also on the future of work. She serves as vice chair of the Council of Europe Committee of Experts on Quality Journalism in the Digital Age. Further to my right, I have Drew Sullivan, who co-founded and served as the first director of the Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Programme, which is basically a global network of 40 investigative reporting organizations. Drew also founded the Journalism Development Network, which is an innovative media development organization with programs worldwide. As a journalist, he's won many awards for his work, and this includes leading a team of reporters looking at corruption by the Bosnian Prime Minister, which actually led to his eventual indictment and resignation. To my left, you'll find Julia Reda. My left, sorry, she's part of the German Pirate Party and is currently a member of the European Parliament in the Greens IFA group. She works a lot on copyright reform, on the defense of freedom of information, on open data, and on personal data privacy. She was a member of the Special Inquiry Committee set up to investigate the Dieselgate scandal. I don't know if that rings a bell. And she's also a member of the Legal Affairs Committee, the Internal Market and Consumer Protection Committee, and the Industry, Research and Energy Committee. So voila, since we don't have that much time, and we'd like to give you all the chance to participate and to have a bit of a discussion and to brainstorm collectively, I'm going to give each speaker about 3 to 5 minutes. We'll try and be a bit strict, sorry about that. And then, I've prepared a couple of follow-up questions, but of course I will open the floor to you so that you can go ahead and we can start brainstorming together. Is that okay for everyone? Great. So, who wants to go first? Maybe Drew?
Sure.
Yeah?
Okay. So just for disclosure purposes, I am not funded by the Green Party here. I came on my own expense, volunteer, to talk about this. I think they've done a lot of great work on this issue. And, you know, the role of government in media is a long one. I mean, if you think about it, they've been funding media to a great extent for a long, long time, starting with the BBC and, you know, national television stations and things like that. In a lot of non-democratic countries, including some European ones, there is a tremendous amount of money that is poured into media. Hungary spends over $1 billion on media itself, you know, and so this is something that has been going on and will continue to go on. The question is how to do this fairly and how to do this in a way that's not going to cause problems for the integrity of the journalists. You know, investigative reporting itself is a public good. Surveys have showed that it returns $100 for every dollar invested in investigative reporting. OCCRP, not counting the public good, just in terms of money, our stories have caused, you know, in terms of seizures, in terms of fines against bad actors, has returned 57,000% on the money. We've seen over $5.7 billion seized because of our stories. So it's a no-brainer. It's a really important public good. And the problem now is there really isn't anybody funding it. The advertising is dropping off. Large companies like Google and Facebook have been pulling money out of journalism rather than putting it in. You know, it's the old thing, you pull a bunch of money out and then you put a couple million back in to make everybody happy. You know, this is a serious problem. The industry of investigative reporting and journalism itself is kind of dead. And so, you know, how do you get that public good? And of course, we're all working on various new models and everything, but government plays a role in this. The problem is how do you determine what good media is? If you go to Orban's government in Hungary, they're going to tell you it's one thing. If you go to Moscow, they'll tell you another. If you go to Paris, they'll tell you another. And so, you know, I think that there needs to be a lot of thought in how we create this media public good, you know, continues to bring back to us, but to determine which ways that we can do this so that you don't get bad media supported. You know, if you do get some bad media supported, it's probably not as bad as not supporting good media. But in the end, I think that there needs to that we need to sit down and come up with policies and practices to fund media so that we as a public have that public service.
Yeah, so in my role as a legislator, I've kind of have to look at this issue of how to best support investigative journalism from several angles. I mean, Drew has mentioned the funding element, which is of course very important, and there is the possibility, of course, for governments to fund journalism directly, and it's a question of building up the structures that make sure that this does not jeopardize the independence and neutrality of that reporting. And I do think that there the European Union has a role to play. There are thought experiments about whether in the long term we should have something like a European public broadcaster or a European public media organization. But even while this is not the case, things like making sure there is multilingual reporting is actually really important, and it's something that also directly feeds into the goals of the European Union as trying to encourage cross-border cooperation. But aside from just the issue of funding, which is of course very important, I think we also need to talk about the regulatory environment in which journalists operate. And there, on the one hand, what I'm always trying to do in my work is on the one hand, to introduce legislation that would make life easier for journalists. So one example of this is a whistleblower protection legislation that we've been advocating for quite a long time, because well, there is not just the issue of securing the funding to be able to do your research. There's also the risks that are associated with it, the risk of lawsuits, of financial risks, but of course also risks to the life and security of reporters, which is also something that we need to pay attention to. And then thirdly, there is of course the question of making sure that we don't pass legislation that makes the situation even worse. And there are some, well, sometimes injustices or idiosyncratic situations in legislation, like for example the fact that we still have a higher value-added tax for digital news than for print news. There can also be things like legislation that is put in place due to industry pressure that ends up having a knock-on effect on journalism. So for example, the European Union introduced a trade secrets legislation that was meant to make it easier for companies to protect their know-how, but of course also has the effect that it can well, lead to lawsuits if you disclose this information. So I think we need to work on all these different angles to the issue of investigative journalism. Funding is very important, but making sure that we don't inadvertently put in place barriers to reporting or things that might get journalists get sued or be discouraged from reporting is also really important.
Great, thank you. Alexandra?
Yes, good morning. That really, what I want to say very well links to what you just said, because I want to make cover three areas in my initial remarks. And one is the financial environment, one is the regulatory environment, particularly with respect to privacy of journalists or journalists, protection of sources, and one is the area of, number three is the area of education. Looking at the finances and funding, I myself grew up in the private sector media. I started my career at the German press agency, worked for Financial Times Germany, the German edition of the Financial Times, and for 12 years for Süddeutsche Zeitung. And yeah, I still believe actually that the private model is the most conducive one to journalism, because there's the least influence, even though I really appreciate having strong public service media, in particular now that the private sector is so much challenged. And you all know that the private sector is challenged, but the major principle that really worked very well for the private sector media was that there was a variety of sources, advertising from a variety of interests, a variety of funding sources, so that not one single source could dominate the process, and the media lived very well with that. And this principle of having a variety of sources that should, I think, guide our thoughts, because it's very hard if you just have one. If you are dependent on one source of funding, then you're really dependent on interest, and it can get much more bureaucratic and more complicated, even with public service media. And I'm just talking about Germany here, not even talking about countries where, maybe public service media, the public service is defined very differently. Talking about that, obviously there's just basically three ways that journalism can get funded. It's either you get funded from public sources, or you get funded by the customer, so you have to sell your products. That has implications, because then obviously journalism is expensive and it has to be valued by your customers. The third one is you have wealthy companies or individuals that support journalism. And I mean, looking at it now, actually the newspaper or the news organization with the best funded news organization right now is probably the Washington Post, because they can be very innovative, do lots of innovative stuff, but the question is this the model of the future? Having just one individual like Jeff Bezos funding the whole thing. I mean, if you talk to Marty Baron of the Washington Post, who's actually on our advisory board, he's very happy with that, because he feels Jeff Bezos is supporting him. But what if Jeff Bezos gets second thoughts about this? So it's a tricky model. So what can politics do to support the financial environment? Obviously, there can be direct funding and support of public service media, but there can also be what you were talking about already, that the tax code could be really conducive to journalists, their products, their endeavors. So, if you have tax reliefs for products or journalists, or even if you fund education for journalists, I mean that would be a very good thing, and would really help. So the tax environment is just one thing that's more an incentive-driven environment and not direct funding, which I think is, for all the reasons already quoted by you also, it's much better than to have just direct funding where the influence is it's much bigger. So that's a financial environment. Talking about regulatory framework and protection for journalists, actually I talked to my former colleague Bastian Obermeier about this. This name might ring a bell because he broke the Panama Paper story. And I told him that I was on this panel, and what would his thoughts be on the political environment for investigative journalism, and he really made this point that privacy rights for journalists and that would be the vital thing, that journalists are protected when talking to their sources, because if you don't guarantee these rights, then sources might be discouraged to approach journalists. So you really shut down any investigative journalism if you lower the protections for journalists. Also, what Julia already said, protection for whistleblowers is a big thing. They really need to feel safe. That's important. Then also the right to know for journalists, the freedom of information for journalists needs to be upheld and established in countries where it's not upheld already. Very important. Also, journalists always run the risks of getting sued, and actually in an environment that gets much more litigious, where lots of law firms are specializing on really suing newspapers or media organizations. That's a really tough thing, and they can sue you into bankruptcy. I mean, that's really a problem they are facing, and that's a big risk investigative journalists are facing with all their endeavors. Is there something maybe not, that makes them vulnerable for lawsuits? So there's some protection that can sue media companies into bankruptcy, because it's also a very big risk for investigative journalists, to endanger all the jobs for their colleagues because they make a mistake or whatever, something happens, and everybody makes mistakes. Yeah, that's a privacy or regulatory framework, and the last point is very brief, very short. Actually, what governments can do or politics can do is really support the education of journalists, and I think this is vital, because every journalist needs to be educated very well to do investigations, about their rights, about techniques, trainings, whatever. And if you educate journalists and really try to grow a new generation of investigative journalists who are equipped with all these skills, that's something that governments or politics can really do to support this education, because having good journalists really will lead to good journalism. Thank you.
Great. So I don't know if anyone already has a question. Maybe to let you get warmed up and think about it, I'll throw one towards Drew. We've heard a lot of different issues that are being faced. I mean, from risks of litigation to problems with funding. When you try and do your investigations into corrupt organizations, what are the pressures that you most often face, or what makes life difficult for you, basically?
Right. Well, the one that's foremost in my mind is safety right now. It's a huge issue. The recent deaths of 2 European reporters. The second one, Jan Kuciak, was working with us at the time of his death. The way that this will play out is that essentially the Slovak government will drag their feet. There'll never be charges filed against the people who ordered the hit. There probably will never be an investigation into the people. 90% of all journalism murders are unsolved, because they often journalists are working at that nexus of crime and government, which is the most dangerous place to be. And so consequently, the system we have for looking at these cases doesn't work, because it's going to be investigated by Slovak authorities, who are probably connected to the people that are involved. And so consequently, there really needs to be a rethinking of this whole process, and we've suggested having an independent body oversee every single murder of a reporter, to at least say, hey, this was a good investigation or this was a poor investigation. You need a second set of eyes looking into national authorities and looking at this case. Journalists are pawns nowadays. We're often murdered to create a sense of instability in a country. This happens in Eastern Europe quite a bit. We're murdered to intimidate the whole industry. We're murdered because they want to blame somebody for something. So we're little pawns on the board that are getting, kind of crushed by these political criminal forces that are going on, and it's not something we want as a society. Secondly, transparency. It's getting increasingly difficult to get access to information, and that makes us go into more difficult situations. We have to go and interview bad people because we can't get the records. And a lot of countries are scofflaws. You can't get a court record in Belgium. That's ridiculous. I can't find out why somebody is a criminal. I can't even find out they are a criminal in some cases. These are ridiculous holes in the transparency system, and we've got one of Europe's biggest transparency fighters up front here and Helen Derbyshire from Access Info Europe. You know, and it's a sad state across Europe, and it's making our job harder, and it's making, you know, what we do harder. And then there's this tend towards, you know, these privacy laws. We get GDPR, emails saying basically you're going to have to take the stuff down on us because of privacy laws that are coming into effect. And there's a whole bunch of, you know, this right to be forgotten. You know, I'm sorry, I don't want to forget criminals. I don't want to forget wrongdoing. I don't want to forget pedophiles. You know, I think we have a right to know what, you know, who is driving our buses, who is driving our ambulances, who is teaching our children. You know, these are fundamental rights. So there has to be a balancing of that. I think it's swung too far one way, and I think we need to have some you know, rational laws on privacy, because that's being used as a means to stop us from getting information. It's a means a lawsuit, and of course lawsuits. We have 6 lawsuits against us right now. You know, you can sue somebody out of business. We have pro bono lawyers. We're hardened to be protective against lawsuits. We write all our stories specifically for lawsuits. But you know, it's a system where there's no well, in the United States they have a rule called SLAPP, which is a SLAPP lawsuit is a nuisance suit, and if you file a nuisance suit, then the court can decide that it's a nuisance suit, and you will be guilty rather than the journalist. And I think there needs to be a similar system in Europe to protect people from these kind of nuisance suits and just using their money and power to kind of bully smaller organizations.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions, or? Helen, go ahead.
Thanks, and thanks for the shout out, Drew. We're going to be talking a bit more about the right of access to information for journalists this afternoon, so I'm not going to ask a question about that right now, but if you're interested, come along at 4:30, legal leaks. My question is actually about the sort of regulatory framework. And I have a huge concern right now. Many good ideas have been mentioned on the panel, so not to repeat those, but to say there were lots of very positive things said. Instead of having regulation that helps protect journalists, what I see is we're in a context where there's a knee-jerk reaction to we need to do something about, call it fake news, call it misinformation, disinformation. And that's really a concern. And at the EU level, the EU has set up this, the European External Action Service has set up this disinformation review, which does not follow any of the the basis on which it works is not transparent. It does not follow any of the established fact-checking sort of codes that have been developed by the global fact-checking community. And it has classified as fake news or disinformation reporting which merely quotes what other people have said. So there was a case from the Netherlands where someone quoted a Russian official saying that the MH17 investigation was not done in the technically correct way. The newspaper wasn't itself saying that, and yet the fact checkers, supposed fact checkers, said, oh no, this is disinformation. And I wonder what we can do to stop that kind of bad regulation whilst at the same time ensuring that we've got the right kind of regulatory framework that protects journalists. Thanks.
If I may respond to that, I think this is a huge challenge because in politics we always have hype topics, and then if you propose something and you can argue that it's a measure against fake news, it's almost guaranteed to go through whether it makes sense or not. And what I see in the European Commission approach to fake news is that they treat it as if it were an issue of illegal content. That, you know, we just need to eradicate lies from the internet, which is obviously absurd. And I think the main reason for that is because it serves other policy goals. So the European Commission has an interest in making platforms remove all kinds of actually illegal content, things like terrorist propaganda, but also things like hate speech or even copyright infringement. And then it's great for them to have this additional topic that is very popular right now and lump it in there, even though it doesn't belong there. And I think this sometimes leads to suboptimal outcomes. And So what I would like to see in terms of regulating the fake news environment is to try to go a bit deeper and analyze what actually makes it different from what we've seen in the past. I mean, propaganda and you know, false reporting is not something new. And there, I think what we actually need to look at is targeted advertising, because a lot of what we call under this fake news phenomenon is, you know, the problem is not that somebody is reporting something false, but that personal data is being misused to target this information to exactly the people who are most vulnerable to it. And that's, I think, what we should be talking about there. And then the other thing is really media literacy education, because even when it comes to these fact-checking issues, I've experienced this myself. Like, for example, I've once been contacted by a fact-checker who told me, yeah, you've been mentioned in this article that has been flagged as fake news, and can you please confirm or deny whether you're an agent of George Soros? I mean, I don't think it's useful to approach fact-checking in that way, and I don't think it's useful to answer to this sort of question. But yeah, so I think it's important that we don't use, you know, the hot topic of the day to try to push an agenda that maybe doesn't have anything to do with it, and maybe take a step back, take a little bit more time to analyze what is actually going on, and then what kind of measures would actually be useful to target that particular problem.
Okay. Alexandra, yeah, how do you see it from your perspective on all these high-level working groups? What are the dangers that you see when you hear politicians talking about how to deal with fake news and all of this?
First of all, I don't think politicians are dangerous. No, actually, they're just trying to do a good thing. Well, many of them do, so I really admire lots of politicians. But we at the Reuters Institute do a lot of research on, we don't even say fake news, we say misinformation. Yeah. That's really important, because actually fake news, remember, has been misused by the American president to discredit established media, and so we just really try to not say fake news. But we've done research on this from the Reuters Institute from an audience perspective, and actually, I mean, you're very right, it's very hard to define what fake news even is, because very often from an audience perspective, it's just poor journalism, because people feel like, oh, something is slanted, something is biased, so, you know, this is fake news, or sometimes it's a real fact even, or a quote, or whatever that is really real, but it's taken out of context and then sold by someone else. So is this fake news? Is it not? Because some person might have said something, but it's just taken out of context. So it's really very hard to define fake news, and so it's very hard to regulate fake news. And actually my colleague Rasmus Nielsen, he was a member of the European Commission high-level group on fake news and misinformation. I think it was fake news and misinformation. And actually, I've been involved in these discussions, because he shared a lot of these discussions with us at the Institute. And there was a huge discussion on, you know, between these two extremes, like, you know, regulate everything and don't do anything. So, I mean, it's always, and actually the organizations who were talking about, they were involved in that high-level group too, but it's always, obviously, if you have, I think there were 40 people in there, so 40 stakeholders, so if you have to come up with, the smallest common denominator, like sort of a document in the end and decisions, it's very hard to navigate between these two extremes. But actually, they came up with a much less regulatory approach, but much more like a soft power approach to fake news and misinformation, because they decided to do the soft power approach. They decided to, for example, they decided on financial support for independent media, fact-checking, and media literacy initiatives. That was one important point. They required, or they said the platforms would be required to share data, to verify stuff. Public authorities need to share data for verification. That was one more outcome. And they decided on a creation of a network of research centers all over the EU to study disinformation, and also a collaborative approach with a structured process that doesn't really punish organizations, but just much more that doesn't really regulate organizations, but sort of just point out or flag when they are not complying with these general standards. I mean, it's always very hard to strike a balance between the regulatory side and the soft power, just self-regulation side. And even within our institute, we are different. Rasmus has a different opinion on this than I do. And maybe it's because I'm German, so I'm more on the regulatory side, because sometimes I think you just have to do something because there have to be sanctions, and you really have to set up some rules, because you can't rely on self-regulation. I mean, just think about self-regulation in gender equality and where that got us. Well, not that very far. So in Germany, we established quotas. So that's just one example where you can see that 20 years of self-regulation really didn't help that much. So, but you have to strike a balance, and obviously lots of education, media literacy, and even a public discussion, a public debate about this is very important and valuable to really point out also the platform companies that they have a responsibility. And I mean, obviously that has been very effective, because these discussions we're having right now at these companies, at Facebook, at Google, whatever, they didn't take place just a few years ago when everybody was still so so excited about all the new possibilities and all the connections and all the social benefits that these companies apparently were giving us. So the public debate is really essential.
So just a quick comment on this. I mean, I think, you know, by the time we figure out a solution to fake news, it won't be a problem anymore. Exactly. You know? And I mean, it was so effective because people were trained to see, when you saw a journalism type article with a name and a byline and news in it, to believe it. We've trained people to do that. And now people know that's no longer something you can do. And so consequently, the effectiveness of fake news will go down. This is a bit of a arms race, though, because, you know, the next level of, you know, bots that are coming along will be able to, you know, read your Facebook profile and design a interaction with you designed to convince you of something. And so you won't even know that you're not talking to a human being. And they'll be able to use all the buttons that they can, you know, figure out to press them against you to make you believe something that may not be true. And that's where it's going to get a little bit more difficult. But, you know, for the most part, you know, you know, we're no longer naive, and we understand that, you know, psychological operations are going to be, every single country are now going to use them against other countries for the foreseeable future. You know, when fake news is disconnected to its source, it's much harder to track when it shows up as a Facebook posting, which you can put those kind of pressures on Facebook and Google to stop that. But when it comes from a source, when you know it comes from InfoWars or something like that, then you can use that to you know, partition that group out and say, okay, this is what this group does, and, you know, this is a Nazi party, and this is this and this and this. And you know, people can make their decisions whether they want to consume that. So I think it's a lot of hand-wringing over something that is losing its effectiveness already.
Does anyone else have any comments on fake news? I was wondering how long we were going to be able to last without saying that. About half an hour, which is all right.
The solution to fake news is good news. I mean, that's, you know, you just have good, strong news, and fake news is not a problem, and you have credible sources of information that people learn. And it's difficult in the internet because credible sources get lost in this whole internet, but, you know, that's the other part of empowering, you know, media, good media, and funding them well, and creating a good support structure for them, because then it helps distinguish them from the bad media.
Yeah, I mean, we've come full circle here, because actually the financial environment for journalism is important. And this whole misinformation debate, I hate to say it, is obviously the big brands, the big media brands are profiting from it. Because, I mean, if you have trusted brands and you can invest a lot in your brands and in your trust, I mean, people will get educated and get trained to rely on big brands, and it really will be much harder for smaller brands. So that's really a big challenge, and I forgot to say that before in my initial remarks, because I was really, I I really meant to make this point. What's really tough is the support of local journalism and all these small organizations, and that's really important to encourage investigations even at the local level, because the big brands will actually profit from the fake news debate. I mean, they also profited from the Trump bump. We saw that at the Institute, that actually in the US, the Washington Post and New York Times really won tons of subscribers because they felt they now needed to support quality journalism. But what is with all the medium-sized newspapers? I mean, just from the US, you just recently, Denver Post, or there were several cases of respected newspapers that were facing another rounds and rounds of layoffs. So the smaller the brand, the harder it will get. So actually solutions for local journalism are really very important to develop also on the political level.
Yeah, I think you raise an important point there about media pluralism, because what we don't talk about in this whole debate around social media is that empirically, actually, this whole idea of a filter bubble doesn't really hold up. That generally, if people are subjected to more diverse sources of information, they are better informed. And, you know, it's always nice to, you know, complain about the young people who only read news on Facebook and stuff like that. But if you actually compare what it does to you if you are only reading one newspaper that you've been subscribed to for 20 years, as compared to reading lots of articles from different news sources, the new model is actually better to have an informed public. Of course, we need to work out the details of how to make sure that this new system is sustainable, because of course it's also a lot easier to finance a newspaper if you have a stable readership base that you can count on coming back every month. But I think generally it's a really good development that people have access to diverse news sources and kind of can put together their own news package. And that doesn't mean that they will only read things that will support their preconceived notions. And when we see lobbyism in this area of news reporting, there is a tendency to believe that whatever the biggest brands say is what is best for journalism and what is best for media pluralism. And we're seeing this especially in the copyright debate, where we have this big a big rift between the very largest publishers who are pushing for this new neighboring right for press publishers that would basically make it more difficult to link to individual news articles on social media and so on, as opposed to going directly to the home page. And of course, that is good for very large brands because they have brand recognition. People will go to their website directly. But it's a catastrophe for local newspapers or for specialized newspapers who often get up to 3/4 of their viewers through so-called referral traffic, so people clicking on links. And they are absolutely dependent on this environment of having social media, having search engines, having individual websites where people can find their content. And I'm going to talk a bit more about this subject on Saturday at 5, so if you want to know more about that and what is going on in the copyright reform, I think there I can go into a lot more detail on this subject. But I would just be very careful if somebody is saying, we want this change in the legislation either to fight fake news or to increase media pluralism, because quite often, you know, the biggest brands don't have a particular interest in increasing media pluralism. On the contrary, quite often it's, well, better for them to kind of pull up the ladder behind them and make sure that their business model is supported.
Which kind of brings us to the issue of maybe this fierce competition that exists between journalists and between different media outlets, where everyone's trying to grow, or where, you know, journalists are pressured to kind of deliver content that can be clicked on and sold really, really quickly. Drew, have you ever been in a situation like this, or maybe to put the question the other way? In your years of really exposing public interest stories, how have you survived?
That's a good question. We've survived, and actually, you know, we've thrived. You know, I think you know, we're moving out into a time of new models that will completely kind of change the whole media landscape. And we, at OCCRP, we're designing ourselves for what we call the journalism commons. The journalism commons will be where we will reside in a place with the public, interacting with the public in a much more intense way, and we're designing the software and we're designing the organization to be that way. So that I don't think the model, you know, we've kind of reached peak advertising. Organizations are getting smart enough. Advertising is not the future of journalism, you know, and we need to find new ways of doing it. And there's plenty of money and there's plenty of support in the public. We reach about 11.8 billion viewers as a nonprofit. We have an advantage over like Süddeutsche Zeitung and the New York Times because we publish through everybody else. We don't, you know, our own website, you know, gets about 8 million viewers a year, but we reach all the rest through other things. And I think that if you embed yourself in the public and you work with the public, if just 1% of those 11.8 billion read our stories, and if only 1% of those people give us just $1, we will fund ourselves forever. You know, I mean, that's all we need, and there's plenty of support in the public out there. So I think you're going to find, especially with investigative reporting organizations, because investigative reporting has never been financially, you know, successful. It's a loss leader for most newspapers. They lose money on it. They make money, you know, overall. It's kind of a, you know, it's their elite little package to say, hey, look, we're great journalists. You know, but there's only 5 or 6 investigative reporters in most large newspapers. I've got over 160 investigative reporters. I got 21 investigative editors. I'm the largest investigative reporting organization on earth. Nobody's heard of us in this room probably before today, you know. But we've broken a number of very large stories, but you read them in The Guardian, and you read them in Süddeutsche Zeitung, and you read them in other places. And that's fine with us. The key here is really re-examining this whole model and saying, if we go beyond the commercial model, then how do we connect with the public and how do we give them money? And the only way to do that is to be there with the public, interact with the public. You know, we're looking at designing, we have a program called Bots for Good, where we're designing bots that will go out to the public and say, hey, we're looking for information on this. You know, can you connect us to people who know this? Can you help us find the information? And if you interact with the public and if you serve them as a public service, doing the stories they want, they will kind of support you. So I'm not worried about the big, you know, the big, you know, players in this game, because I don't think that's what matters. I think what matters is local news, local people, local finding out what's going on in your world, and then marshaling that to educate each other, and that's where we're going in the future.
So basically you are a not-for-profit organization who doesn't sell any of your content. You give it all away for free.
Yep.
And basically your funding model is reliant on donations from citizens. But do you also get government funding? And if so, what checks or what firewalls are put in place to make sure that that funding doesn't affect the way you do your work?
We do get government funding, and that's really unusual in the investigative reporting business. I'm probably one of the few organizations on earth who does this. And the firewall is really simple. You know, they signed an agreement saying they cannot influence us. They cannot ask us anything like that. And I know when I'm being influenced, and I know, you know, I've taken US government money and written about Donald Trump. Donald Trump is funding me technically, and we've written negative stories about him, okay? Maybe because he doesn't know we're there.
Exactly.
Don't
tweet that because they'll see it.
But we're prepared to forego all U.S. government money. You know, we're also funded by the Swiss government, by the UK government, by the Argentine government, by the Australian government. So if you get a basket of funds, and we've got institutional donor support, we get money from Google, we get money from Omidyar Network, we get money from you know, Open Society Foundation. So, you know, but the goal is to get rid of all of those monies. They've been very good monies. Nobody has ever asked us to do anything. But the goal is really that the money is with the public, and we just have to do a better job of connecting ourselves to the public, and that's what we're working on over the next 5 years. So.
Yeah, since you just did all the self-advertising now, being the biggest investigative newsroom, I want to challenge this a little bit, and I want to talk about, make a point that's maybe not usually popular, but I mean the sad thing is really that we have to always single out investigative journalism and talk about investigative journalism, because when I started out as a journalist, I mean, actually the conception was that every journalist should be sort of an investigative journalist, because this is what journalism used to be about: investigating stories, investigating, holding power to account, and finding out stuff that other people didn't know. The fact that now everybody's building up investigative departments and investigative journalism just tells us that actually this is a skill that got lost on the way, because we had so much, we had this development of so much copy and paste journalism in newsrooms all over, where there were just people hired to just sit at their desks all day and copy and paste stuff that was really, that clicked well on other screens. So lots of journalists today are just not even used to, picking up a phone, talking to people, finding sources, whatever. So now this whole trend goes back to, look at investigative journalism and singling out investigative journalists as really something important, whereas while I think that actually this is the original mission of journalists, being investigative, and that's why I made my initial point about education of journalists, that it's so important to really go back to the roots and tell journalists this is what you are there for, not to just increase clicks and do stuff that runs well on your website because it ran well on somebody else's, but just really get the stories. And yeah, you said that what did you say? The solution to the fake news problem is good news. So yeah, make journalism great again with just really do great investigations. That's just really the point.
But may I ask though, I mean, is it really realistic to tell a journalist who has to report about the news of the day to be investigative? I mean, I understand kind of the difference being how much time you spend, how deep you go, and is that really possible if your requirement is, something is happening at 8 o'clock in the morning and it has to be online at 10?
Sure. I mean, there are different roles in newsrooms, obviously, but this is also something that these roles are not fixed. Like, I mean, in Germany, actually, in German newsrooms, these roles are much more fluid than in other countries where you just have reporters here on one side and editors on the other. Right. Actually, in Germany, there's a lot of interchange, and we could debate about if this is always a good thing. But I mean, it's very nuanced. I mean, you're not only an investigative journalist if you engage in like a Panama Papers type project that takes you a year and where you analyze, so many zillions of data, bytes, whatever. But you're also, I mean, finding out something that nobody has found out before is also something that's sort of investigative in a way. So you don't, to build up this big thing like investigative journalism that also discourages journalists, regular journalists, they feel like, oh, this is something I can't do, I'm not like a hacker, or I'm not I'm not that brilliant, I can't really meet in a parking lot with some anonymous sources. I mean, yeah, not everybody can be, Bob Woodward or Bastian Obermeier or whatever, but still lots of journalists can do lots of things that are, investigations. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I actually studied communication science, and this is supposed to be kind of a studies that prepares people to become journalists. And I mean, as part of my studies, we've never done something like file a freedom of information request. Like, this is not necessarily something that is part of the education of journalists.
The reality, too, is that our society is getting incredibly complex, and the biggest problem I actually have is scaling. I can't find enough journalists, because Sebastian Obermeier, who we work with, is a wonderful journalist. But to create another Sebastian Obermeier, that takes 15 years and a brilliant mind to start with. And there's just not that many brilliant minds. And, quite frankly, there are a lot of brilliant minds. They're just not all in journalism. And, we're bringing in, we use a lot of programmers. Our programmers now are getting into investigative reporting, and they love it, and they're working on tools to, to find the stories so that maybe a lesser journalist who doesn't have the skills to do the really deep, journalism, when you get into corruption, it's about business. You have to be able to read a prospectus and understand a prospectus and get the information out of it and see that there's an offshore account here that leads to an offshore account here that leads to another offshore account here. And you need to keep that all in your mind, and you need to, we don't have the tools, and we're working on building the tools, but we're getting really far off the subject here, so I apologize. I'll finish up. But we can design some of the tools to make everybody a better investigative reporter. But really great investigative reporters, I've got maybe 6 on my staff of 160. you know, who can reliably always get me that great investigative story. They're really rare people, and they're really difficult to find, and they're really difficult to scale. So in a complex society, you need complex minds who are capable of complex work, and that really is an art form still.
I think there is also a reaction. I mean, not all, you know, all lobbying forces, all stakeholders necessarily have an interest in there being a lot of good investigative journalists, and we're seeing this this tendency towards information control, especially coming from large corporations, and surely the protection of trade secrets is a big part of that. But another thing that is being discussed at European level at the moment is to have control over data sets, not in a privacy sense, but in this often in a kind of intellectual property sense. Like, it has never been a problem to read something. You never needed permission to read something. But if you use a computer to read something, like for example, if you want to use automated processing to go through a huge data set like the Panama Papers, this is supposed to be a copyright infringement in the future, and you actually need permission from the rights holders of that information to process it automatically. Like, this is part of the European Commission copyright proposal. And I think this is just absolutely bizarre when you think about the fact that the Panama Papers, you know, it's just completely absurd to suggest that you would have to ask permission from the source to be able to automatically process their data sets. It's absolutely bonkers.
Our backup plan is we have our servers in Europe now, but we're planning to move them offshore and just violate the law in Europe. So that's our plan. We're not gonna, you're not taking away our data. And we'll fight everybody in court who tries to go for copyright stuff on us. But, you know, this is one of the problems that, you know, nobody really knows how to handle all this information. Nobody, and there's a lot of large vested interests who are trying to game the system and pass laws, you know, that will make this harder, because everybody's looking on how they're going to make some money out of everything. And, you know, I don't think, you know, the European Parliament does not have a lot of experts in this, and a lot of people, maybe willfully or maybe just not willfully, don't understand some of these complex issues, and that makes it more frustrating sometimes to, you know, in dealing with policy issues when you're talking to members of Parliament. You, on the other hand, you're very good, so you're easy to talk to. But you know, the problem is other people don't always understand what you're saying or the implications of it.
Does anyone in the audience have any questions or reactions? Or yes.
I would just like to come back about the regulatory issue that we talk about. As you know, there is a law that has been adopted at the European Parliament about the confidential business information. So you all said that you want to protect more journalism, and that's a good thing, but how can we do it as there is that kind of law in Europe?
Right. So we voted against the Trade Secrets Directive, so we tried to prevent it from happening in the first place, but unfortunately we were not successful with that. So that means that now all European countries have to implement it into their national law. And like, for example, in Germany, where I'm from, the proposal for a national law has just been published. So it's kind of, now is the time to look at what this is going to look like in practice. And there are a few things to look out for. So, for example, there is an exception for whistleblower protection. And in the Parliament, when we worked on this, we made very sure that it shouldn't matter what the intention of the whistleblower is. What matters is this information that they are publishing in the public interest? Then the trade secrets protection should not apply. In the German proposal that we now have, it suddenly talks about the intention to work in the public interest. And I think this is something that really opens the door to strategic lawsuits against whistleblowers and trying to do character assassination in court and saying, well, the real reason why you published this is not the public interest, it was because you don't like your employer or whatever. And so I think it's really important to pay attention to that this is done right when it's done, when it's implemented into national law. The other thing is that the directive says that trade secrets should only be protected if a company has taken active steps to protect that information. So it shouldn't be the case, like, for example, you know, a mouse running through a restaurant shouldn't be a trade secret. Like, it's not something, you know, it's not know-how that the business is trying to protect from other people finding out. It's just information about something that, you know, where they have screwed up. So I think the Trade Secrets Directive is far from perfect, but at least we've tried to build in a few safeguards, and it's not automatic that every member state will really put them into their national laws. So there we really need to be careful and make sure that all the safeguards that are built into the directive actually end up in the national implementation.
And I mean, we really tried to campaign very hard to get the other groups in the European Parliament to realize that trade secrets was basically stifling freedom of expression and was going to screw everyone over. We were in the minority, but we managed to somehow embarrass the socialist group enough that they are now really on board with a whistleblower protection directive. So in their mind, you know, they have adopted trade secrets, and now they're trying to balance that out with a whistleblower protection directive, which possibly the Commission might already publish a proposal next week.
Yeah. It's important, though, to know that trade secrets are not just a problem for whistleblowers. They're also a problem for journalists in their day-to-day lives. Like, for example, freedom of information requests have been rejected on the grounds that they would reveal confidential business information, for example, in public-private partnerships. And so what the directive does, it defines more things as trade secrets than it ever used to be in the past. And that is really a big problem for anybody who wants to get access to information, also from the government.
Any other questions, reactions?
I just had a sort of quick follow-up question on the challenges we have of regulating in a totally new era. This information, I mean, it is changing the game. And I wanted to pick up on something that Drew mentioned earlier, which was not being able to get access to court records. One of the things that we've seen around Europe, around the world, is a lot of information which in a pre-internet era was available. Court records, land registers, company registers, and so on and so forth, is now no longer available, because making it available means putting it on the internet, and suddenly there's some kind of psychological thing there about it was okay to have a few people who went to the company's house to look through the company records, but suddenly if everyone can see who owns a company, oof, don't like that. Now, we're having these discussions about which information should be open, about people's criminal records, for example, in a context in which a lot of us are demanding protection for our privacy and our private data against companies like Facebook. And that complicates enormously the debate about which is the information that is okay to process, which is the information it's not okay to process. I don't think that the new General Data Protection Regulation comes anywhere close to solving that debate. I think it's going to cause a lot of limitations for transparency. But if there was one ask for the politicians, I would say that we have to look into this properly in terms of which is the information that we need to ensure remains in the public domain.
Well, I do think it makes a difference whether something is theoretically available if somebody goes and looks for it, as opposed to everything is available and can be mined and can be profiled. Because, I mean, in the past, it was a lot easier for somebody who might be in a vulnerable position to be open about what their name is and who they are. Like, imagine, for example, you're a victim of stalking. It wouldn't have been a problem in the past to, you know, you meet a stranger to tell them what your full name is and to kind of have a conversation. But if all of this information is public record and is not going to be deleted, you have to be a lot more careful. So I think there are lots of examples also where, you know, this transparency can put people in jeopardy. I mean, we've been talking about the question whether or not people who ask freedom of information requests should be revealing their identity or even their postal address, which is something that the European Commission requires. And so I think, you know, unfortunately, you can't pass data protection legislation that only applies to the good guys. So you have to accept the fact that everybody can make use of it, and then the question is, okay, at what point is there an overriding public interest? And I think, yeah, we need to work that out anew, because it does make a difference whether information is available in the long term and can be combined. Like, you can find out so much about a person just from their social media activity that can, you know, give you information about where they live, whether they're at home at a particular point in time, and so on. So, you know, we have to make sure that we can't just make everything transparent because it would help journalism, because we also have to protect the security and the identity of the people who are doing the reporting.
You're touching on a very important debate here that has to be led, and it hasn't even begun to be led. We need special protection, special rights for journalists? Obviously we do, and we have, and I was at a UNESCO roundtable last night where we were addressing this problem, and because obviously you could say, you know, you give special protection and rights to journalists, but then who's a journalist with all the new media organizations that are coming up, small independent organizations, and yeah, there will be a lot of discussion about, you know, who qualifies as a journalist. That used to be no problem at all, because obviously you can't make every information accessible to everybody. So you need to find some guidance and some rules, but there will be lots of discussions in the future who is a journalist and who gets this special protection and who doesn't, because they just want to exploit that information for whatever commercial purposes or whatever purposes.
And there's technologies coming down the pipe. I mean, we get free satellite photos from a company. It gives us free satellite photos. And they told us that within 5 years, they would be able to give us 24-hour, around-the-clock video surveillance of every spot on Earth from space. And that this will be available to us. And, you know, as an investigative journalist, I said, great, but the implications of this are really quite serious. And that's not going to be controlled by the EU, because that will be offshore. And a lot of data is offshore. I can set up in my front yard a sensor that looks at every single driver's license and every single face and match that against, you know, databases to build a database of who's moving around, you know, my town. And you'll find a lot more people doing that. Private data collection is going to be the big business in about 10 years from now. And there will be a whole bunch of information that's, you know, 4D printing is going to allow your sensor, your walls to become sensors and identify your unique body heat pattern, and so they can uniquely identify you and figure out what you're doing. So every single wall and every single building will become basically a spying device. These are all technologies that come, and if you don't think people aren't going to use this capability, you're completely wrong. They will use the capability. There will be a Facebook of walls in the future that will be buying this data commercially and use it to do certain things. So privacy is dead. You just don't realize it. The privacy is long dead. And these laws are way behind the time. Laws always come well after the horse is out of the barn, unfortunately. It's not going to be a pretty scene between, you know, parliaments trying to control this and companies collecting this data. But it's out of the bag, and we need to plan for that future. My concern is that the public does not get access to that information. You know, if that information is going to be collected, it's going to be in the hands of wealthy businesses and governments, and it's not going to be in the hands of the public. That's a scary thing. I believe in radical transparency. We should just I should be able to get access to your bank accounts. I'll give you access to mine, okay? You can't commit crimes when all that information is out there. And so we have to look at this in the long run as you know, what's in the best interest for the public. And maybe it's radical transparency. I'm not, you know, we're not there yet, so I can't say. I know.
I think, yeah.
I hope not.
Maybe Julia can
I mean, I
respond
think
to this
it's,
one.
yeah, there is a big difference if you are part of a privileged group in society, then radical transparency can be a really good thing. But if you're not, then it's a huge problem. So for example, if you look at things like hate speech, and people sometimes say, oh, anonymity on the internet is the problem. But the fact is that a lot of hate speech is posted under people's real name because there's complete impunity. But on the other hand, for the people who are victims of hate speech, it's extremely important to be able to communicate anonymously on the internet. So I think that this radical transparency is not going to work if we don't first, you know, solve patriarchy and racism, which is probably not going to happen anytime soon. So you know, if we had a society that didn't work on the basis of those biases, then it might be kind of a utopia that could function, but I don't see that happening.
No, I feel, I mean, we're getting very far away, but radical transparency is no solution at all. I think people need their private space, they need their privacy, they need to be allowed to make mistakes, to change decisions, to reverse things in life. If radical transparency leads to everybody being just open to, yeah, for everybody else. I think the private space is something very important. But I mean, I agree with you. It's going to be very hard with the upcoming technological possibilities to safeguard that. But radical transparency can't.
The point is, you may not have a choice. The thing is, you're going. The companies are going to have it anyway. And so the question is just whether the public gets it too. I think anytime you give data, information, power to governments and businesses and not give it to the people, then you're going to end up getting manipulated, as Facebook has and other organizations will manipulate things. So, you know, the question is, do you want everybody to have access, or do you want to, you're not going to be able to stop the companies from having it. You know, I just think that we have to, this is an issue we're going to have to decide on.
Yeah. I think it's more a question of regulating global capitalism. So the question is not, you know, I wouldn't throw up my hands in the air and say privacy is dead and we can't do anything about it. The reason why it's so difficult at the moment is because we have companies that act at a global level and that can evade regulation, but we don't have regulation that actually is democratically legitimized at a global level. And there I think the EU passing a data protection regulation is a much better approach than an individual country passing a data protection legislation, because here at least we have the chance of it becoming the basis for a global standard. I do think we will have global data protection legislation eventually, but we don't even have the structures for it in order to regulate companies on a global level.
But because of offshores, we will always have something that you'll be able to get around it, and that's the problem. There will always be, you know, I'll be able to go to the Solomon Islands and sign in and get copies of all of your heat signatures. You know, there will always be, you know, some system, because that's what business and governments want.
But when it comes to taxation, obviously we try to close those loopholes. Like we try to close the possibility to
Has that worked on taxes?
It hasn't worked yet, but that doesn't mean that we say, okay, well, we can't solve it, so let's give up on taxation.
Okay, so since we have to wrap up and this debate is heating up intensely, tomorrow, you know, we're flying back to Brussels. So what should we do when we get back to the office to deal with this issue? Give us one thing that we should do tomorrow, just to wrap up. And the audience as well, if you have a great idea that we should do tomorrow, let us know.
I mean, that's since we don't have a common fiscal policy across the European area. I mean, that's a hard thing to say, but encourage individual countries to pass a tax code that's conducive to good quality journalism.
I would submit a bill that requires that all journalism murders in Europe be investigated by an independent party.
I think those are very good proposals. I'm fortunately not flying back right away. I'm actually staying until Sunday, but I think, yeah, those are good ones, and I think, yeah, it touches really upon being able to make decisions together, because on the taxation thing, it's usually just one country blocking something from going forward.
Okay, so that's going to be it for now. Thank you very much for being here. There's one message that I'd like you to take away with you, which is, you know, there are people in the European Parliament who care deeply about media freedom and pluralism issues, so please do reach out to us. send us an email, tweet at us, whatever, and we really want to work with you on these issues, so don't forget that. Thank you.